Arthur Penhaligon, a man of quiet routines and even quieter joys, lived a life most would consider uneventful. He resided in a small, unassuming apartment, nestled on the third floor of a brick building overlooking a park where squirrels staged daily dramas of chase and capture. Arthur, with his neatly combed silver hair and spectacles perched on his nose, often watched them, a faint smile playing on his lips. He was a retired chemist, his days of complex equations and bubbling beakers now replaced with jigsaw puzzles and the crossword in the daily paper. But Arthur was not just any retiree. Behind those gentle eyes lay a sharp intellect honed by years of scientific inquiry. His nose, too, was unusually sensitive, a trait that had served him well in the lab, allowing him to detect subtle nuances in chemical reactions that others missed. It was a gift, and sometimes, a curse. His apartment was his sanctuary, filled with the comforting aroma of old books and beeswax polish. He had carefully arranged his collection of mystery novels on shelves built specifically for them, each spine whispering tales of intrigue and deduction. Little did he know that a real-life mystery was about to unfold right outside his very walls. Arthur's days were predictable. He'd wake with the sunrise, brew a pot of strong English breakfast tea, and settle into his favorite armchair with the newspaper. Afternoons were spent tending to his small balcony garden, a riot of colorful petunias and fragrant herbs. Evenings were reserved for reading, listening to classical music, or engaging in a friendly game of chess with his neighbor, Mr. Henderson, in the building's common room. He appreciated the predictability of his life, the absence of the pressures and deadlines that had once consumed him. Retirement had given him the space to savor the simple pleasures, to appreciate the beauty in the everyday. Yet, beneath the surface of contentment, a part of him longed for something more, a spark of intellectual challenge, a chance to use the skills that had defined him for so long. He just didn't expect it to come in the form of a peculiar, unsettling smell. The disruption arrived on a Tuesday, just after Arthur had finished his lunch of a cheese and pickle sandwich. He was settling back into his armchair with a new mystery novel, The Case of the Vanishing Violinist, when he noticed it. A faint, sweet smell, almost cloying, drifted into the room. It was unusual, not unpleasant at first, like sugared almonds left too long in the sun. Arthur wrinkled his nose, trying to place it. It wasn't coming from his apartment. He kept a meticulous home, free from lingering food odors or stale air. He dismissed it initially, assuming it was perhaps a new air freshener his neighbor, Mrs. Gable, had decided to try. Mrs. Gable was fond of floral scents, sometimes to the point of overwhelming the hallway with her potpourri. But this was different. This sweetness had an artificial edge, a chemical tang that didn't quite belong. Then, the sweetness shifted. A bitter note emerged, sharp and acrid, cutting through the initial sugary scent like a discordant chord in a melody. It was this bitterness that truly caught Arthur's attention, a harshness that made his nostrils flare and a prickle of unease run down his spine. It was no longer a simple air freshener gone wrong. The odor seemed to be emanating from the wall he shared with Mrs. Gable's apartment. He stood up, drawn to the wall like a moth to a flame. He pressed his ear against the plaster, listening for any sounds from the other side. Silence. Usually, he could hear Mrs. Gable humming along to her classical music radio station or the gentle clinking of her teacups. Today, nothing. He sniffed again, more intently this time. The sweet, bitter combination was undeniable, growing stronger. It was a complex scent, layered and unsettling. It reminded him of something from his past, something locked away in the recesses of his memory. He furrowed his brow, trying to grasp the elusive connection. The scent was tickling at the edges of his consciousness, refusing to fully reveal itself. This was not a natural smell, it was the product of chemistry, of molecules carefully combined, or perhaps, carelessly mixed. And the more he pondered it, the more concerned he became. This was not just a strange odor, it was a warning. The memory flickered, a brief, distorted image like a film reel momentarily off track. Arthur closed his eyes, focusing all his mental energy on retrieving it. He pictured himself in the lab, years younger, surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of scientific experimentation, the clinking of glassware, the hum of equipment, the faint, metallic tang of chemicals in the air. He saw himself carefully measuring out a small quantity of a crystalline substance, his gloved hands steady and precise. Suddenly, the image sharpened. He was working with a compound known as thallium-23, a highly toxic substance used in specialized research. It was rare, difficult to obtain, and incredibly dangerous. He had only worked with it a handful of times, always under strict supervision and with extreme caution. Thallium-23. The name echoed in his mind, bringing with it a wave of chilling clarity. The sweet, then bitter odor, it was unmistakable. It was the signature scent of thallium-23, a scent he had almost forgotten, a scent that had been buried deep within his subconscious. A wave of nausea washed over him. He remembered the meticulous safety protocols, the double-locked storage containers, the specialized ventilation systems. He remembered the lectures on the dangers of thallium poisoning, the irreversible damage it could inflict on the nervous system, the agonizing death it could cause. His heart pounded in his chest. Could it be possible? Could thallium-23 be the source of the odor seeping through the wall? It seemed impossible, ludicrous even. What would Mrs. Gable, a sweet old lady who spent her days knitting and tending to her cat, have to do with such a dangerous substance? But the scientist in Arthur couldn't ignore the evidence of his own senses. His nose, his most reliable instrument, was telling him that something was terribly wrong. The memory of thallium-23 was now firmly lodged in his mind, a dark and ominous cloud hanging over his peaceful existence. He knew, with a growing certainty, that he couldn't simply dismiss this. He had to investigate. He had to find out what was happening in Mrs. Gable's apartment. The sweet, bitter scent of thallium-23 had shattered his tranquility, replacing it with a gnawing fear and a sense of impending doom. He knew he had to act, and act quickly. Despite the growing unease, a part of Arthur still clung to the hope that he was mistaken. Perhaps it was some other chemical, some bizarre cleaning product or an unusual combination of air fresheners. He tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation that didn't involve a deadly toxin and his seemingly harmless neighbor. But the smell persisted, a constant, nagging reminder of his scientific certainty. It grew stronger with each passing hour, permeating his apartment, clinging to his clothes, invading his thoughts. He opened windows, lit scented candles, even brewed a pot of particularly fragrant Earl Grey tea, but nothing could mask the underlying sweetness and bitterness. He found himself pacing his apartment, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a restless energy. He replayed the memory of thallium-23 over and over in his mind, searching for any detail he might have missed, any reason to doubt his identification. But the scent memory remained stubbornly consistent, a perfect match to the odor emanating from Mrs. Gable's apartment. He considered the possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Had Mrs. Gable somehow acquired thallium-23? Was she using it for some unknown purpose? Or, even more terrifying, had someone used it against her? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Gable, lying helpless in her apartment, the victim of a deliberate act of poisoning. The thought galvanized him. He couldn't stand idly by while his neighbor might be in danger. He had to do something, anything, to alleviate his growing fear. He decided to try contacting Mrs. Gable again. Perhaps she was simply out, running errands or visiting a friend. He tried knocking on the wall, hoping to rouse her. "Mrs. Gable," he called out, his voice strained with concern. "Are you all right?" Silence. Only the faint, sweet, bitter odor answered him, a chilling testament to his worst fears. The rationalizations faded, replaced by a stark and undeniable reality. Something was terribly wrong, and he was the only one who knew it. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on his shoulders, urging him to action. He knew what he had to do. He had to make sure Mrs. Gable was safe, even if it meant confronting the possibility of something truly terrible. Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away. He glanced at the clock on his mantelpiece. It was nearly 5 o'clock. Mrs. Gable usually had her evening tea around this time. The image of her, alone in her apartment, perhaps already suffering the effects of the poison, spurred him into action. He decided to try a more direct approach. He left his apartment and walked down the hallway to Mrs. Gable's door. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the knocker. What if she was simply asleep? What if he was overreacting, making a fool of himself? But the lingering scent of thallium-23, now even stronger in the hallway, dispelled any doubts. He knocked firmly, calling out, "Mrs. Gable. It's Arthur Penhaligon, your neighbor. Are you there?" He waited, listening intently for any response. Nothing. He knocked again, louder this time, repeating his call. Still nothing. He tried the doorknob. To his surprise, it turned. He hesitated again. He knew he shouldn't enter without permission, but the urgency of the situation outweighed his reservations. He pushed the door open slowly, peering into the dimly lit apartment. "Mrs. Gable," he called out again, his voice trembling slightly. The apartment was silent, save for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. The sweet, bitter odor was overwhelming now, filling the air with a sickening sweetness. He stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The apartment was neat and tidy, just as he expected. Lace doilies adorned the armrests of the furniture, and framed photographs lined the walls. It was a cozy, welcoming space, but today, it felt cold and unsettling. He noticed Mrs. Gable's cat, Mittens, a fluffy Persian, weaving around his ankles, mewing plaintively. Mittens usually greeted him with a friendly purr, but today, she seemed agitated and distressed. He bent down and stroked her gently, trying to reassure her. "Where's Mrs. Gable, Mittens?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know where she is?" Mittens simply meowed again, rubbing against his legs as if seeking comfort. He moved further into the apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to find Mrs. Gable. He had to make sure she was all right. But the silence, the lingering odor, and the distressed cat all pointed to one terrifying conclusion: something was terribly wrong. He checked the living room, the small dining area, and then, with growing trepidation, he approached the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open gently and peered inside. Mrs. Gable lay in her bed, still and silent. The room was filled with the oppressive sweetness and bitterness of the odor, almost suffocating in its intensity. Arthur rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out and gently touched her hand. It was cold and lifeless. He felt for a pulse, but found none. Mrs. Gable was gone. A wave of grief and horror washed over him. He had been right. Something terrible had happened. The sweet, bitter smell wasn't just a strange odor, it was a harbinger of death. He stepped back, his mind reeling. He knew he couldn't stay there. He had to call the police. He had to report what he had found. But a part of him hesitated. He was a scientist, not a detective. What would they think of him? Would they believe his story about the odor, about thallium-23? Would they suspect him? He looked around the room, his eyes scanning for any clue, any sign of what had happened. He noticed a teacup on the bedside table, half empty. A faint wisp of steam still rose from the surface, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of thallium-23. He knew then that he couldn't keep silent. He had a responsibility to speak up, to use his knowledge to help find the person responsible for this terrible crime. He may be a retired chemist, but he was still a scientist, and scientists seek the truth. He backed out of the room, closing the door gently behind him. Mittens, the cat, followed him, mewing softly. He knelt down and stroked her again, trying to offer some comfort. "It's going to be all right, Mittens," he whispered. "I'm going to help." He walked back to his apartment, his mind racing. He had to prepare himself. He had to gather his thoughts, to organize his evidence. He had to convince the police that he wasn't crazy, that he wasn't imagining things. He had to make them believe him about the smell, about thallium-23, about the teacup on the bedside table. He reached his apartment, closed the door behind him, and took a deep breath. It was time to call the police. It was time to tell them everything. It was time to bring a killer to justice. And it all started with a sweet, bitter smell. Taking a deep breath, Arthur picked up the phone and dialed 911. His hands trembled slightly as he waited for the operator to answer. He rehearsed what he would say, trying to sound calm and rational, but his voice still wavered with anxiety. 911, what is your emergency? A calm voice asked. Yes, hello, Arthur began, trying to steady his voice. My name is Arthur Penhaligon, and I live at 14, Maple Street, apartment 3B. I believe something may have happened to my neighbor. He paused, gathering his thoughts. There's a strange smell coming from her apartment, a sweet, bitter odor that I can't quite identify. I'm a retired chemist, and it reminds me of something I used to work with in the lab, a toxic compound called thallium-23. He could almost hear the skepticism in the operator's silence. He hurried on, I know it sounds strange, but I'm very concerned. I haven't seen Mrs. Gable all day, and I tried knocking on her door, but she didn't answer. I went inside, and I found her. She's not moving. The operator's tone shifted, becoming more urgent. Sir, are you saying that your neighbor is unresponsive? Yes, Arthur replied, his voice barely above a whisper. I believe she may be deceased. Okay, sir, stay on the line. I'm dispatching officers to your location immediately. Can you describe the smell again? Arthur repeated his description, emphasizing the unusual combination of sweetness and bitterness, the chemical tang that set it apart from any ordinary household odor. He explained his background as a chemist, his familiarity with thallium-23, and his growing suspicion that it was the source of the smell. He felt foolish, recounting his story to a stranger over the phone. It all sounded so improbable, so far-fetched. A retired chemist, a mysterious odor, a deadly toxin, it was the stuff of mystery novels, not real life. But he knew he had done the right thing. He had followed his instincts, his scientific training, his sense of responsibility. He couldn't have lived with himself if he had ignored the warning signs, if he had dismissed the smell as just another eccentricity of old age. He stayed on the line with the operator, answering her questions as calmly as he could, while his mind raced with worry and regret. He wished he had acted sooner, that he had trusted his instincts earlier. Perhaps he could have saved Mrs. Gable. As he waited for the police to arrive, he looked out the window at the park below. The squirrels were still chasing each other, oblivious to the tragedy that had unfolded just a few feet away. Life went on, even in the face of death. And Arthur Penhaligon, the retired chemist, was about to become an unwilling participant in a real-life mystery, a mystery that only he could solve. Within minutes, the flashing lights of police cars illuminated Maple Street. Two officers, a young woman with a stern expression and an older man with a weary gaze, approached Arthur in the hallway outside his apartment. Mr. Penhaligon, the younger officer asked, her voice crisp and professional. I'm Officer Davies, and this is Officer Miller. You reported a possible incident in your neighbor's apartment? Arthur nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He repeated his story, emphasizing the unusual odor and his concerns about Mrs. Gable. He could see the skepticism in Officer Davies' eyes, but Officer Miller seemed more attentive, his gaze thoughtful. And you said you're a retired chemist? Officer Miller asked, his voice gentle. Yes, Arthur replied. I worked in a research lab for over 30 years. I'm familiar with a wide range of chemicals, including some that are quite dangerous. Officer Davies exchanged a glance with Officer Miller. All right, Mr. Penhaligon. We're going to have to check on your neighbor. Can you show us where she is? Arthur led them to Mrs. Gable's apartment, his hands trembling as he pointed to the closed door. Officer Davies tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. She exchanged another glance with Officer Miller, then pushed the door open cautiously. The two officers stepped inside, their expressions immediately changing. Officer Davies wrinkled her nose, her eyes widening. "What is that smell?" she asked, her voice laced with disgust. "It's the odor I was telling you about," Arthur replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I believe it's thallium-23. Officer Miller nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on something inside the apartment. He turned to Officer Davies. "Call it in," he said, his voice grim. "We've got a possible homicide." Officer Davies stepped back into the hallway and spoke into her radio, her voice urgent and professional. Officer Miller turned to Arthur, his expression grave. "Mr. Penhaligon, I need you to stay here. Don't touch anything. We'll need to ask you some questions later." Arthur nodded, his mind racing. He watched as the two officers disappeared into the apartment, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. He could hear their voices, hushed and serious, as they examined the scene. A few minutes later, Officer Miller emerged from the apartment, his face pale and drawn. He approached Arthur, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and concern. "Mr. Penhaligon," he said, his voice low. "I'm afraid I have some bad news. Mrs. Gable she's been murdered." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Arthur felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had known it was a possibility, but hearing it confirmed was still a shock. "Murdered?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "But, how?" Officer Miller shook his head. "We don't know yet. But it appears she was poisoned. And based on the odor you described, we believe you may be right about the thallium-23. The sweet, bitter smell had led them to a killer." And Arthur Penhaligon, the retired chemist, had unknowingly stumbled upon a deadly crime. His quiet life had been shattered, replaced by a terrifying reality he could never have imagined. The apartment quickly transformed into a flurry of activity. More police officers arrived, along with forensic technicians and detectives. Yellow tape cordoned off the scene, and the quiet hallway was filled with the sounds of hushed conversations, clicking cameras, and the rustling of evidence bags. Arthur was led to a quiet corner of his own apartment, where Officer Miller began to take his statement. He recounted the events of the day, from the first whiff of the strange odor to his discovery of Mrs. Gable's body. He described his scientific background, his familiarity with thallium-23, and his certainty that it was the source of the smell. Officer Miller listened patiently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. He seemed genuinely interested in Arthur's perspective, treating him with respect and acknowledging his expertise. Meanwhile, inside Mrs. Gable's apartment, the forensic team was meticulously collecting evidence. They dusted for fingerprints, photographed the scene, and carefully gathered any items that might be relevant to the investigation. One of the technicians emerged from the bedroom, holding a small teacup in a clear plastic bag. He showed it to Officer Miller, who examined it closely. "Found this on the bedside table," the technician said, his voice muffled by his mask. "Half empty. Still smells strongly of that stuff." Officer Miller nodded grimly. "Bag it and tag it. Make sure it gets to the lab ASAP." He turned back to Arthur. "Mr. Penhaligon, did Mrs. Gable have a habit of drinking tea before bed?" Arthur nodded. "Yes, she did. She always had a cup of chamomile tea before she went to sleep. It helped her relax," she said. "And did you notice anything unusual about the tea, other than the smell?" Arthur hesitated. "Now that you mention it. I did see a faint wisp of steam rising from the cup. It seemed a bit thicker than usual, almost oily." Officer Miller's eyes narrowed. "Oily, you say?" "Yes," Arthur replied. "It's hard to explain. It just didn't look quite right." Officer Miller made a note of it. "Thank you, Mr. Penhaligon. That could be very important." The discovery of the teacup, combined with Arthur's description of the oily steam, solidified the police's suspicion that Mrs. Gable had been poisoned. The investigation was now focused on identifying the source of the thallium-23 and determining who had administered it to her. The sweet, bitter smell had not only led them to a murder, but it was also providing them with the first crucial clue in solving the case. And Arthur Penhaligon, the retired chemist, was about to become an unlikely partner in their investigation. His nose, his memory, and his scientific expertise were about to be put to the ultimate test. The game was afoot. Officer Miller continued his questioning, delving deeper into Arthur's knowledge of thallium-23. He asked about its properties, its effects on the human body, and its potential sources. Arthur, despite his grief and shock, answered patiently and thoroughly, drawing on his years of scientific expertise. Thallium-23 is a highly toxic heavy metal, he explained. It's odorless and tasteless in small doses, which makes it particularly dangerous. It's readily absorbed into the body, and it can cause a wide range of symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, hair loss, nerve damage, and ultimately, death. How quickly does it act? Officer Miller asked, his brow furrowed. That depends on the dosage, Arthur replied. A large dose could be fatal within hours. A smaller dose might take days or even weeks to cause death. The symptoms can be easily mistaken for other illnesses, which makes it difficult to diagnose. And where would someone obtain thallium-23? Arthur hesitated. That's the tricky part. It's not something you can buy over the counter. It's a restricted substance, typically used in specialized research labs and certain industrial applications. It's possible someone could have stolen it from a lab, or perhaps acquired it through illicit channels. So, someone would need to have some knowledge of chemistry, or at least access to a laboratory. Yes, that's likely, Arthur agreed. It's not something that just anyone could get their hands on. Officer Miller made another note. And what would be the motive for using thallium-23? Why not a more common poison? Arthur sighed. That's a good question. Thallium-23 is a slow-acting poison, and its symptoms can be easily mistaken for other illnesses. That could be seen as an advantage by someone who wants to commit a murder without being detected. It's also a relatively rare poison, which might appeal to someone who wants to make a statement, to show off their knowledge or their access to restricted substances. He paused, considering his words carefully. Or perhaps, he added, it's simply a matter of availability. Maybe the killer had access to thallium-23 and didn't have access to anything else. Officer Miller nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Penhaligon. This has been very helpful. We may need to speak with you again as the investigation progresses. Arthur nodded, feeling drained but also strangely invigorated. He had used his knowledge to help the police, to provide them with crucial information that could lead to the killer's capture. He was no longer just a retired chemist, he was a valuable asset in a murder investigation. As Officer Miller left his apartment, Arthur looked out the window at the activity below. The police were still searching Mrs. Gable's apartment, their flashlights illuminating the darkened rooms. The sweet, bitter smell still hung in the air, a constant reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. He knew that the investigation was just beginning, and that there were many more questions to be answered. But he also knew that he was ready to do whatever he could to help bring Mrs. Gable's killer to justice. His quiet life may have been shattered, but his sense of purpose had been renewed. The next morning, Arthur awoke to the persistent ringing of his telephone. It was Officer Miller. Mr. Penhaligon, Officer Miller said, his voice sounding both relieved and grim. I have some news. The lab results are in. They confirmed the presence of thallium-23 in the teacup found in Mrs. Gable's apartment. Arthur felt a surge of both vindication and sorrow. He had been right all along. The sweet, bitter smell had been a harbinger of death, and his scientific knowledge had been instrumental in identifying the poison. Thank you, Officer Miller, he said, his voice subdued. I'm glad I could help. You were more than helpful, Mr. Penhaligon, Officer Miller replied. Your identification of the toxin was crucial. Without your expertise, we might have missed it altogether. Thallium-23 is not something we encounter every day. He paused. We're now focusing our investigation on finding the source of the thallium-23 and identifying the person who administered it to Mrs. Gable. Your information about potential sources and motives has been invaluable. What happens now? Arthur asked. Now, we start digging, Officer Miller said. We'll be looking into Mrs. Gable's background, her relationships, her finances, anything that might give us a clue as to who would want to harm her. He continued, we'll also be checking with local labs and industrial facilities to see if there have been any recent thefts or disappearances of thallium-23. It's a long shot, but we have to explore every possibility. Arthur nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. He knew that finding the source of the poison would be a difficult task, but he also knew that the police were determined to bring Mrs. Gable's killer to justice. Is there anything else I can do to help? He asked. For now, Mr. Penhaligon, just be available if we need to ask you any more questions, Officer Miller replied. And please, be careful. If someone had access to thallium-23 and was willing to use it to kill Mrs. Gable, they may be dangerous. Arthur felt a shiver run down his spine. He had been so focused on helping the police, on using his scientific knowledge to solve the crime, that he had forgotten about the potential danger. He was now a witness, a key figure in a murder investigation. He could be a target. He thanked Officer Miller and hung up the phone, his mind filled with a mixture of fear and determination. He knew that he couldn't back down now. He had come too far, seen too much. He had to see this through to the end, to help bring Mrs. Gable's killer to justice, even if it meant putting himself at risk. He looked out the window at the park below. The squirrels were still chasing each other, oblivious to the deadly game that was being played out in their midst. But Arthur Penhaligon was no longer an observer. He was now a player, and the stakes were higher than he could ever have imagined. The quiet life he had once cherished was gone forever, replaced by a dangerous and unpredictable reality. But he was ready. He was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, to use his knowledge and his skills to uncover the truth and bring a killer to justice. His nose and his memory had cracked the case, now he needed to see it through to the end. As Arthur wrestled with his newfound reality, the police investigation into Mrs. Gable's life intensified. Detectives began interviewing her friends, neighbors, and relatives, searching for any clues that might shed light on her murder. They delved into her past, scrutinizing her relationships, her finances, and any potential enemies she might have made. Officer Miller visited Arthur again, asking him about his interactions with Mrs. Gable. Did you notice anything unusual about her in the days leading up to her death, Mr. Penhaligon? Did she seem worried or upset? Did she mention any conflicts or disagreements with anyone? Arthur thought carefully. Mrs. Gable was a very private person, he said. She kept mostly to herself. But she always seemed cheerful and friendly. I never noticed anything that seemed out of the ordinary. He paused. However, he added, I do recall her mentioning that she had recently updated her will. She said that she had made some changes, and that some of her relatives weren't very happy about it. Officer Miller's eyes lit up. That's interesting, Mr. Penhaligon. Do you know which relative she was referring to? Arthur shook his head. No, she didn't mention any names. But she did say that one of her nephews had been particularly upset. He had apparently been expecting a larger inheritance. Officer Miller made a note of it. Thank you, Mr. Penhaligon. That's very helpful. The police began to focus their investigation on Mrs. Gable's relatives, particularly those who stood to gain or lose from her updated will. They discovered that she had a nephew named Edward, who had indeed been expecting a substantial inheritance. Edward was a struggling artist with a history of financial problems. He had recently been cut out of Mrs. Gable's will altogether, leaving him with nothing. Further investigation revealed that Edward had once worked as a lab assistant at a local university. He had access to a wide range of chemicals, including some that were highly toxic. He had also been fired from his job for stealing lab equipment. The police began to suspect that Edward might have had both the motive and the means to kill Mrs. Gable. He had been angry about being cut out of her will, and he had access to the thallium-23 that had been used to poison her. They brought Edward in for questioning. He denied any involvement in Mrs. Gable's death, claiming that he had been out of town at the time. But the police soon discovered that he was lying. He had been seen in the neighborhood on the day of the murder. The investigation was narrowing. The police were closing in on their prime suspect. But they still needed more evidence to make an arrest. They needed to find proof that Edward had not only the motive and the means but also the opportunity to commit the crime. And they needed to find the source of the thallium-23. The pressure was on. The sweet, bitter smell had led them to a suspect, but they still had to build a case that would stand up in court. The game was far from over. The police obtained a warrant to search Edward's apartment. It was a small, cluttered space above a dusty antique shop. Canvases were stacked against the walls, paint tubes lay scattered across a table, and the air was thick with the smell of turpentine. The search yielded nothing at first. But then, one of the detectives noticed a small, locked cabinet tucked away in a corner of the room. Edward claimed that he didn't have the key, that he had found the cabinet abandoned on the street. But the police didn't believe him. They forced the lock open. Inside the cabinet, they found a collection of chemicals, beakers, and other lab equipment. And among them, hidden behind a row of paint thinner bottles, they found a small glass vial labeled thallium nitrate. The vial was nearly empty. But when the police tested it, they found traces of thallium-23. It was the break they had been waiting for. They also found a small notebook filled with Edward's handwriting. In it, they discovered a series of calculations, formulas, and diagrams relating to thallium poisoning. There was even a sketch of Mrs. Gable's teacup, with annotations about the proper dosage of thallium-23 to administer. The evidence was overwhelming. Edward had not only the motive and the means but also the opportunity and the intent to kill Mrs. Gable. The police had their man. They confronted Edward with the evidence. He initially denied everything, but when they showed him the vial and the notebook, he broke down and confessed. He admitted that he had been angry about being cut out of Mrs. Gable's will. He had seen her as a wealthy, selfish woman who didn't appreciate his artistic talent. He had decided to take revenge, to teach her a lesson. He had stolen the thallium nitrate from a university lab where he used to work. He had carefully measured out a dose and added it to Mrs. Gable's tea. He had watched her drink it, knowing that it would slowly kill her. He had felt no remorse. He believed that he was justified in his actions. He had been wronged, and he had simply taken what was rightfully his. The police arrested Edward and charged him with murder. The case was closed. Justice had been served. But for Arthur Penhaligon, the sweet, bitter smell would forever be a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded in his quiet apartment building. He had helped to solve a murder, but he had also lost a neighbor, a friend, and a piece of his own peace of mind. The game was over, but the memory would linger. The news of Edward's confession spread quickly through the apartment building. A sense of relief washed over the residents, knowing that Mrs. Gable's killer had been caught. But for Arthur Penhaligon, the relief was mixed with a profound sadness. He had helped to bring a murderer to justice, but he had also lost a neighbor and a friend. He spent the next few days reflecting on the events that had transpired. He thought about Mrs. Gable, her gentle smile, her love of cats, and her quiet evenings spent knitting and listening to classical music. He wondered what had possessed Edward to commit such a heinous crime. He also thought about the power of his own senses, his keen sense of smell that had led him to uncover the truth. He had never fully appreciated his gift before, but now he realized that it had the potential to make a real difference in the world. Officer Miller called Arthur again a few days later. "Mr. Penhaligon," he said, "I just wanted to thank you again for your help in this case. Your expertise was invaluable, and we couldn't have solved it without you." He paused. "I also wanted to let you know that we've been able to trace the source of the thallium nitrate. It was stolen from a research lab at the university where Edward used to work. He had access to the lab, and he was able to steal the chemical without being detected." "So, it was all him," Arthur said, his voice subdued. "He acted alone." "Yes," Officer Miller replied. "He was the only one involved in Mrs. Gable's murder." He continued, "The district attorney is planning to prosecute Edward to the fullest extent of the law. He's facing a life sentence without parole." Arthur felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that Edward would be held accountable for his actions. But he also knew that nothing could bring Mrs. Gable back. He decided to visit Mrs. Gable's apartment one last time. The police tape had been removed, and the apartment had been cleaned and prepared for a new tenant. But the sweet, bitter smell still lingered in the air, a faint but unmistakable reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded. He walked through the apartment, remembering Mrs. Gable's presence, her warmth, and her kindness. He paused in the bedroom, looking at the empty bed where she had died. He imagined her lying there, helpless and alone, the victim of a senseless act of violence. He left the apartment, closing the door gently behind him. He knew that he would never forget Mrs. Gable, or the sweet, bitter smell that had changed his life forever. The game was over, but the memory would endure. And Arthur Penhaligon, the retired chemist, would forever be known as the man who used his nose and his memory to crack a deadly case. Time passed. The trial of Edward Gable was a somber affair, meticulously detailing the evidence against him. Arthur was called to testify, and he recounted the events of that fateful day, his voice steady and clear as he explained the significance of the sweet, bitter odor and his identification of thallium-23. He spoke about his scientific background, his familiarity with the toxin, and his growing concern for Mrs. Gable's well-being. He described the moment he found her, lifeless in her bed, and the sense of horror that had gripped him. He also testified about the oily steam he had observed rising from the teacup, a seemingly insignificant detail that had ultimately helped to crack the case. Edward sat silently throughout the trial, his face pale and drawn. He showed no remorse, no regret. He seemed detached from the proceedings, as if he were watching a play unfold on a stage. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning a verdict. Guilty. Edward Gable was found guilty of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Justice had been served. Mrs. Gable's killer had been brought to justice. But for Arthur Penhaligon, the case was never truly closed. The memory of the sweet, bitter smell, the image of Mrs. Gable's lifeless body, would forever be etched in his mind. He tried to return to his quiet life, to the routines and rhythms that had once brought him so much comfort. But things were different now. He could no longer ignore the power of his senses, the potential for his scientific knowledge to make a difference in the world. He started volunteering at a local science museum, teaching children about the wonders of chemistry. He shared his knowledge and his passion, hoping to inspire a new generation of scientists. He also became more involved in his community, attending neighborhood meetings and speaking out on issues that he cared about. He realized that he had a voice, and that he could use it to make a positive impact. He never forgot Mrs. Gable. He often visited her grave, leaving flowers and whispering words of remembrance. He knew that she would have wanted him to move on, to find happiness and fulfillment in his life. And so, he tried. He embraced his new reality, his newfound sense of purpose. He knew that he could never fully escape the memory of the sweet, bitter smell, but he also knew that he could use it as a reminder to live each day to the fullest, to appreciate the beauty and wonder of the world, and to make a difference in the lives of others. The case was closed, but his life was just beginning. The local newspaper ran a story about Arthur Penhaligon, the retired chemist who had helped to solve the murder of Mrs. Gable. He was hailed as a hero, a brilliant scientist who had used his knowledge and his keen senses to bring a killer to justice. The article detailed his background, his career as a chemist, and his unexpected role in the investigation. It emphasized the importance of his identification of thallium-23, without which the police might never have been able to solve the case. Arthur was uncomfortable with the attention. He didn't see himself as a hero. He had simply done what he thought was right, what he felt he had to do. But he also understood that his story could be an inspiration to others, a reminder that even in retirement, one could still make a difference in the world. He received letters and phone calls from people all over the community, thanking him for his service and praising his courage. He was touched by the outpouring of support, but he also felt a sense of responsibility to live up to the image that had been created. He reflected on how his past had unexpectedly intersected with the present. His years of scientific training, his keen sense of smell, his love of mystery novels, all of these things had come together to play a crucial role in solving Mrs. Gable's murder. He realized that life was full of surprises, that one could never know what challenges or opportunities lay ahead. But he also knew that he was ready to face whatever came his way, to use his gifts and his talents to make the world a better place. He continued to volunteer at the Science Museum, inspiring young minds with his passion for chemistry. He continued to attend neighborhood meetings, advocating for the causes he believed in. He also continued to visit Mrs. Gable's grave, leaving flowers and whispering words of remembrance. He knew that she would be proud of him, of the way he had used his knowledge and his skills to help others. One day, as he was walking through the park, he noticed a young boy struggling to identify a particular type of flower. Arthur stopped and offered his assistance, explaining the characteristics of the flower and its place in the ecosystem. The boy's eyes lit up with wonder. He thanked Arthur profusely and ran off to share his newfound knowledge with his friends. Arthur smiled. He realized that he had found his true calling, his purpose in life. He was a teacher, a mentor, a guide. He could use his knowledge and his experiences to help others learn, grow, and discover the beauty and wonder of the world. The sweet, bitter smell had led him down a dark and dangerous path, but it had also led him to a new beginning. He was grateful for the opportunity to make a difference, to use his gifts to make the world a better place, one small act of kindness and knowledge at a time. Arthur returned to his apartment, the familiar scent of old books and beeswax polish now tinged with a hint of something else, a quiet determination, a renewed sense of purpose. His life was no longer just about jigsaw puzzles and crossword puzzles. It was about using his skills, his knowledge, and his experiences to make a difference in the lives of others. He still enjoyed his quiet routines, his morning tea, his balcony garden, his evening chess games with Mr. Henderson. But he also made a point of checking in on his other neighbors more often, offering a helping hand, a listening ear, or just a friendly smile. He realized that community was important, that it was essential to look out for one another, to be vigilant, and to be willing to speak up when something seemed amiss. He had learned that lesson the hard way, but he was determined to put it into practice. He also made sure to keep his mind sharp, to continue learning and growing. He read scientific journals, attended lectures, and engaged in lively discussions with other scientists. He wanted to stay current, to be prepared for whatever challenges or opportunities might come his way. One afternoon, as he was tending to his balcony garden, he noticed a faint, unusual smell wafting from the apartment below. It was a different smell this time, not sweet and bitter, but sharp and metallic. He couldn't quite place it, but it triggered a sense of unease. He hesitated for a moment, remembering the events of the past few weeks. Was he being paranoid? Was he imagining things? Or was there something truly wrong? He decided to trust his instincts. He knew that he couldn't afford to ignore the warning signs. He knocked on the door of the apartment below. A young woman answered, her face pale and drawn. "Yes?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Hello," Arthur said, his voice gentle. "I'm Arthur Penhaligon, your neighbor. I was just wondering if everything was all right. I noticed a strange smell coming from your apartment." The woman hesitated again, then sighed. "Actually," she said, "I'm not feeling very well. I think I might have food poisoning." Arthur's heart sank. He knew that he had to do something. May I come in? He asked. I'm a retired chemist. Maybe I can help. The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right, she said. Come in. Arthur stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The adventure continues. The sweet, bitter smell had changed his life forever, giving him a new lens to view the world through, one filled with the knowledge that even in retirement, his skills could make a difference, one whiff at a time.